Welcome to a brand new episode of the Watchmen Companion Podcast presented by The Disorderly. This week, Season 1, Episode 5, entitled Little Fear of Lightning, which was essentially, as it says in the HBO description, an origin story for Wayne Tillman, a.k.a. Looking Glass. Last week, I ended things by saying how much I liked this character, and, how I hoped Watchmen basically doesn't flip the script on us, turn him into a bad guy. So imagine my concern when I found out this entire episode was going to be about Looking Glass. I was hoping things would turn out well as we dug deeper into the past, but as you know, with Lindelof, there's no predicting it. You don't know which way he's going to go with things. Well, this particular origin story begins in 1985 Hoboken. Wade is a young Jehovah's Witness looking to spread the good word to a bunch of sinners at a carnival in New Jersey. Plenty to choose from. He targets a group of burnouts who slap all the pamphlets out of his hands, but then a girl tells him to leave him alone and leads him into a funhouse. After a brief conversation about the end of the world and impending nuclear war between the Soviets and the U.S., the girl takes all of Wayne's clothes off with the implication that they're going to sleep together because, after all, Wayne is a virgin and he wouldn't want to get nuked before he got fucked. That was a direct quote. But the whole thing was a trick to steal his clothes and leave him naked and embarrassed. Now, honestly, imagine being in that position. What would you do? Like, that's got to be a pretty goddamn traumatizing experience, right? But, of course, it became almost a footnote because as he's staring at this room of mirrors and chastising himself for being a filthy, dumb sinner, a high-pitched ringing is heard in the distance and mirrors are shattered all around him. When he finally comes to and walks out of the funhouse, he sees piles of dead bodies, including the girl who stole his clothes, with blood coming from, their mouths, noses, ears, eyes. Pretty brutal stuff. Wade is left hysterically screaming, "What happened?" as the camera pans back across the Hudson River into Manhattan, or at least central New York, where you finally get a glimpse of this giant squid that was dropped in the city by Adrian Veidt. Now, I thought that was particularly fascinating as a comic book fan, because I always felt like the giant squid thing was a little cheesy. And I assume that's why Zack Snyder's version changed the ending to Dr. Manhattan being that outside threat. But in this scene, where you actually see the up-close and personal fallout from the squid attack, it's pretty fucking brutal and violent, and it really sort of drives home the horrors of that event in a way that the comic book didn't, at least for me. So that was the first time you're like, oh, wow, this is actually a horrifying thing. Millions and millions of people died, and it's not just like this weird, sci-fi monster squid type thing. I mean, it is, but you're seeing the real effects of it. Well, cut to present day where Wade is watching a focus group testing a New York City tourism commercial. By the way, shout out to Christopher from The Sopranos, who likes his squid with a lemon and a little bit of marinara. It appears that the focus group gig is Wade's version of Angela's Bakery. Their day job, just a cover story. I actually think they confirmed that later in the episode. But also, before I forget, it makes perfect sense why Wayne would have an underground bunker like a doomsday prepper, given his history with being near the squid attack. And for anyone unfamiliar with comics and who is maybe confused by the whole squid thing, I think I talked about it in a previous episode, but I'll give it some brief context as a reminder. Adrian Veidt teleported the giant squid into the middle of New York, killing half the population of the city with a psychic shockwave. That shockwave is what caused a bunch of the carnival goers to, pour blood out of their faces. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Laurie's taking control of the investigation. Her directive is to find the church where the initial 7th K video was filmed and hopefully find the 7th Cavalry that way. That TikTok video from the beginning. But let's dive back into Wade's origin story. We learn a lot more details from Laurie. She asks if, he's scared shitless because she's heard that people in the psychic black zone still wake up in the middle of the night screaming, even 30 years after the fact. He insists he's fine, but she also asserts that he only joined the Tulsa police force after the White Night as an excuse to wear his shiny mask, which is made of something called reflectitine, a material that apparently protects against psychic blast. That would also, fit the whole underground bunker paranoid thing. Wade, he's still living in fear that another interdimensional attack is coming, and he's taking steps, someone called them paranoid, precautions, to not be susceptible to another attack. Also, Laurie bugged his cactus and overheard Angela mention something about the pills that old man Will gave her. In the next scene, we really get to see the depths of Wade's paranoia. Not only does he wear the Looking Glass mask when he doesn't have to, because as Laurie said, he's living in a fear of another attack, and it's, I guess, for lack of a better term, the sanest way to cover your head in reflectitine. He also has reflectitine lining in the inside of his red baseball cap, so he can, kind of socially wear that material and still not really stand out when he isn't in the mask. And his house and bunker is rigged with this elaborate squid alarm system, I guess. with which he's conducted apparently 500 drills, despite the manual saying you shouldn't run a drill more than once every 6 weeks. He's paying an exorbitant amount of money to get another unit rush delivered when his original unit malfunctions, and you can see how much fear he really is living with and how much of a detriment this is on his life. Now, the company is called Extra Dimensional Security, by the way. It's unclear if any of this stuff actually works or if it's just a scam aimed at paranoid people and people who are struggling with this attack and this horrible event, and even just struggling with the fact that our dimension might not be the only dimension and all these really complex things. I don't know if these things actually work. I would assume they don't, because the actual attack itself is a hoax. So it's pretty messed up that this company exists solely to prey on those people. But yeah, by the way, let's talk about Forever Pet, a biomedical company where they take your pet's exact DNA and clone it, so you never have to say goodbye to your beloved animals. It's pretty fucking terrifying, actually. Also, all the employees are twins, which is either a clever marketing gimmick or they're actually cloning humans as well. Either way, I'd say it's a fair guess that Lady True is probably behind the industry, and clearly the ability to clone or genetically create humans exists, because we already saw her do it at the beginning of the last episode. This animal replica thing is pretty messed up, though. It's a grim business. If the smallest mistake is made and create an exact copy, like in this situation, there's a puppy that's a little smaller than the other one, they just toss the puppy into an incinerator. It's pretty fucked up. Pretty Lindeloffian. Yeah, man. I don't know. Weird, wild scene. Anyway, Wade's ex-wife, Sylvia, works at this lab. That's why this is even in the show. And she finds that the pills are something called nostalgia, which are memories in pill form. Something that existed in the past and now is illegal because it can cause you to go crazy. It can give you psychosis, but more on that later. By the way, it's clear that Wade and Cynthia's separation is a recent one. For one, Wade is, still getting mail at the house for Cynthia. He drops it off. You can actually see when he's rifling the mail when he gets home. He also calls her Cynthia Tillman and has to correct himself and say, oh, sorry, Cynthia Bennett. So he's clearly not used to the change. It's also clear that his marriage failed because he was mentally unwell. Those things are not, unconnected. That's exactly why the marriage failed. Cynthia says that for 7 years, she tried to convince Wade that she wasn't going to leave him naked and run off with his clothes. So the incident that we saw at the beginning of the episode clearly deeply scarred Wade, if she even knows about it. And when you couple that with the events of 1985, the squid attack, we're really getting a full picture of why Wade is the way he is. Even the comment at the end of the exchange where he says 7 years of bad luck, which is a reference to the superstition of breaking glass. The worldview that drives everything that Wade does is this sort of fear and paranoia and, ultimately insecurity. But it's not like he isn't trying, right? He runs a support group of victims of extra-dimensional anxiety. He explains that, this fear can be explained away by saying if the squid hadn't arrived when it did, that the U.S. and Soviet Unions would be, at nuclear war, and we'd all be ash, and everything would be destroyed. So the squid, as bad and horrific as it was, I think he calls it an abomination. It was necessary, and it prevented the end of the world, basically. It united the world's superpowers against a dangerous outside threat from another dimension, which, of course, was Adrian Veidt's plan all along, but Wade doesn't know that this was planned. He just thinks that this is the fallout that naturally occurred after this alien attack. I liked the parallels of Wade continuing to pass out pamphlets and preach to a group of followers, despite the message and purpose being very different from that, in his Jehovah's Witness days. I thought that was a clever tie-in. And then, of course, the parallel of a single woman splitting from the group, luring Wade towards this deception. It was his worst fear manifesting itself again, or at least one half of his worst fear, the non-squid part of it. She used his fear and paranoia to manipulate him, and it was all orchestrated with the dropping of the lettuce on the truck bed, getting him to follow her. He even echoes that same sort of internal dialogue he had back in 85 when he says, "Way to go, dummy, you sure can pick him." Another kick in the ball is coming up. Turns out they were leading him right to the church, which isn't a church at all. It's a soundstage maybe. It looked like some sort of TV studio. It's all staged inside this warehouse, and a bunch of men and women in Rorschach masks are playing around with an interdimensional portal and throwing basketballs through it to kind of track where they get teleported to, experimenting, if you will. To be specific, it was actually something called a CX924 teleportation window, which is the same model that something called the Institute of Transdimensional Studies was using the night of the squid attack. In other words, a portal similar to this one was used by Adrian Veidt back in 1985 to transport a giant squid from his secret lab into the center of New York City. When Wade accuses Senator Keene of attempting to do the same thing in Tulsa, Keene said, well, not that exactly, but something new. Because the same exact plan would be unoriginal, which is also kind of a meta sort of shout out to what Lindelof is doing with Watchmen. He's not going to drop another giant squid because that wouldn't be an original concept. We already saw that in the comics. This is going to be sort of related, something similar, but also something new, so it's an original piece. But here's the big reveal here. Senator Keene is the head of the 7th Cavalry. But he wasn't behind the White Knight, apparently, according to him anyway, if you can believe him. He said he assumed leadership of the 7th K after the White Knight to make sure that it wouldn't happen again. He also said that Judd assumed control of the police force for the same purpose, and through those two poles of leadership, they had a shared goal of keeping the peace. So why then did he bring Wade in on this secret plan? Well, Keene suspects Angela Abar is either the one responsible for killing Judd, or she knows who did, and he wants Wade to steer Lori's investigation towards that conclusion. If Wade fails to help with the plan, Keene will just reveal Angela's identity to the 7th Cavalry and have them kill her and her whole family. So while I'm sure Wade doesn't want to frame Angela, it appears that the alternative is even grimmer. And Keene just needs to get Angela off the board for a few days while he finishes his plan, whatever that is. This brings us to an interesting crossroads as far as who is in cahoots with who, what's going on here, and I'll do my best at the end of the episode to paint a picture of the board as it stands right now. But first, let's dive into this DVD that Kane plays for Wade. It was a message from Adrian Veidt to Robert Redford, taped on November 1st, 1985, with the instructions to wait until January 21st, 1993 to press play. In the message, Adrian is congratulating Redford on his inauguration despite recording it more than 7 years prior. How was he able to predict this election? Because he didn't predict it. He planned it. In this video, Adrian Veidt is explaining exactly what happened on that day in 1985, the day that the alien attacked. It wasn't a monster from another dimension at all. It was an elaborate, meticulously engineered hoax to save the world. It also reveals that Veidt is, behind the whole thing. Squidfall phenomena as well, or as he describes them, additional small-scale extra-dimensional events. Basically, he says that he did everything in his power to get Robert Redford elected president, and he now asks that they be partners in building a utopia. He says he'll take the next few hours to explain what he means and answer any possible questions, but we, the viewers, don't get to see any of that. By the way, it looks like Adrian was standing in front of the giant squid eye, which was a nice touch, I thought. And I loved how Wade was, physically backing away from the television screens while this is all happening. Probably something he didn't realize he was even doing, just a natural reaction to the complete shattering of his worldview. He was physically, but also, subconsciously distancing himself from the information. Oh, and even just the wall of TVs. That was kind of a clever nod to Adrian Veidt's secret lair from the comics as well. I mean, what a scene. And what a crescendo for the entire episode. Though I suppose the real crescendo came at the end when Wade got Angela to admit that she covered up Judd's murder. The cactus, of course, was still bugged, so as soon as she admitted it, Lori came out and arrested her. Angela quickly chugged all the pills, which should theoretically give her a look at her grandfather's memory. Also, we learned earlier in the episode it could drive her into psychosis. But we wrap this episode by seeing Wade leave his hat in the car and throw away the alarm system that he ordered, indicating that he no longer believes in this extra-dimensional attack, and now that he knows the truth, that it was all a hoax, he doesn't need those silly items from that company anymore. But then he goes back for the alarm because maybe he's not quite convinced. Or maybe he just isn't ready to fully abandon a belief system that he's embraced for 30 years. Both seem perfectly plausible and perfectly human. And the last thing that we see is a van pull up to his house. 4 armed members of the 7th Cavalry get out and walk towards his front door, locked and loaded. Then the credits. I mean, it would make sense, right? That Wade is way too big of a liability to be left alive knowing what he knows. He did his part in getting Angela arrested, and now Keene no longer has any use for him. But where they decided to end the episode is unclear whether Wade survives the attack or not. He's drastically outnumbered, but he's also a extremely fearful individual, and I wouldn't put it past him to have his home rigged with explosives or some sort of booby traps or some sort of ingenious way of fighting off home invaders. But I guess we'll find out next week. Finally, it's time for our weekly segment, What the Hell is Adrian Veidt Up To? This week, he's catapulted himself outside of the atmospheric bubble that he's living in to land on what I suspect, or I think I read this somewhere, is a moon of Jupiter. There's a bunch of frozen Mr. Phillips and Miss Cruikshank bodies from previous catapulting attempts, and he arranged these broken corpses into a message. Now, we only see part of the message. We see the words, "Save me, D," but the rest of that word is cut off. Safe to assume maybe it's Dr. Manhattan. It could be an intentional misdirection. I don't know. At any rate, he's directing this message towards the satellite that's pointed at him, and he screams, "I did it," before promptly being yanked back into the atmospheric bubble by a man named the Game Warden, who also happens to be wearing a mask, which is interesting in this world. Why would he be wearing a mask? This mystery Game Warden individual places Adrian under arrest, whatever that means, and then kicks him in the face. All right, so let's talk about where things stand with this plan and where things could potentially be heading. Given all the, ticking clock references and the way that the comics were constructed, it's safe to assume that everything is moving towards one massive event at the end of this story, this season, this series. And that event is scheduled to take place in 3 days, from episode 4, I guess. So maybe 2 days now. It depends on how much time has passed since then. This is according to Lady True, who we know is working with Old Man Will. We've seen them in the same room. They've talked about having a deal and deals getting broken and whatever. So we know that they are in cahoots for sure. They have some plan ready to hatch in 3 days involving that millennial clock in some way. It also seems that they're behind the death of Judd in one way or another because, of course, Old Man Will was right next to the body in his wheelchair. Whether he did it or, I don't know. We don't know how a 100-year-old was able to do that. Maybe he's super strong still because maybe he's hooded justice, not sure. Meanwhile, Senator Keene is using the 7th Cavalry to enact a plan of his own involving an extra-dimensional teleporter similar to the one that Adrian Veidt used. Based on his language, it seems that this plan is also set for 3 days' time, meaning that both of these plans are synced up. Now, that has to mean they're connected, but we don't know how. Right? Are they literally the same plan? Is everyone working together? Or is one plan in place to counter the other one and derail the other team's plan? I don't know. And the big outside forces here are Dr. Manhattan and Adrian Veidt. How will Dr. Manhattan come into play, if at all? Who is keeping Adrian Veidt in this artificially created world, given the satellite, biomedical sort of clone creations, and then even just the vivarium sort of feel to this atmospheric bubble? I think it's safe to assume Lady True is imprisoning Adrian. But why? To what end? Will Dr. Manhattan save him? And why would he? For what purpose? There are all these unanswered questions and what continues to be one of the most gripping mysteries I've seen on television, probably since Leftovers, to be honest. So buckle up, guys. Angela just took a ton of memory pills. The next episode is going to be a trippy one, for sure. It's going to be like an acid trip type episode. Probably extra hard for me to break down as well, but that's for me to worry about. Don't worry about it. You guys just focus on enjoying the rest of your week and make sure you tune in next week for more. Oh, and it's worth mentioning the bit about the movie Pale Horse. Now, it was a Steven Spielberg film, according to the dialogue on the show, that came out in 1992 and was named after the band Pale Horse, who was apparently playing Madison Square Garden the night of the squid attack. Now, this movie features a little girl in a red dress, despite the movie being otherwise black and white, and she's walking around New York City post-attack, surrounded by dead bodies and tentacles, just terrified. Does that sound familiar? In the real world, our world, Steven Spielberg came out with Schindler's List in 1993, so, around the same time as this Pale Horse movie, and it also features a famous scene with a little girl wearing a red dress in an otherwise black and white film. So this squid fall changed the course of history for Spielberg, who felt that a tragic film about this 1985 incident in New York City was more pressing. It was a film he needed to make versus, the one about the Holocaust. Also, tobacco is a controlled substance in this world, so there's that too. But I'm out, guys. Thank you for listening. What a crazy show. Tune in next week. Peace.